Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of major shifts during the 18th century, right? So we left off in class and left off after our trivia game or before our trivia game or however you want to look at it, discussing the major shifts during 18th century Europe, right? Focusing in on the 1700s, as Kendall so astutely pointed out during our review one day in class, right? So we're going to be discussing another set of major shifts that are going on during this time period, particularly one focusing in on the power level of one of the countries in Europe, and then also another one focusing in on the rise of global markets and kind of how that's going to begin to integrate into like pseudo-primitive capitalism, right? That thing that Adam Smith so ardently tried to define as being a new system of integrated economics, right? Now, the thing that we need to understand about it, though, more than anything else, is let's go ahead and dive headfirst into this, okay? Just so we can actually go over a bunch of stuff in this flip and then not necessarily take up the entire rest of your break, right? And by the way, I will get your tests graded probably by the end of the day tomorrow, so be on the lookout for those, all right? So the big thing about it, though, okay, going into it is you got to understand that there are currently, when we are looking at the 1700s period of European history, there are two spheres of the global market, all right? So when we're looking at the global market, you're talking about the actual globalized marketplace, the entire planet, right? Now, when we're discussing the global market, though, in general, what you have to understand in this little bit of a baby review, because a lot of the stuff that we're about to talk about, you've already heard before, but the thing that you have to understand, though, okay, is that during this portion, okay, during this exercise, during this flip, don't write things down unless you absolutely feel like you need to, right? So if you absolutely feel like you need to do it, go ahead and write those things down. And a lot of you I know will write every single thing I'm about to say down just because you don't want to make sure that you don't miss anything. And look, hey, Brianna Bourne to the world. It doesn't hurt. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't hurt to go over these things second, third time, right? Because it's going to help you remember it on that all-important AP test in March. All right, so here we go. Biggest thing about it, though, is we got two spheres of the global marketplace, right? We are talking about the Atlantic sphere and the Pacific sphere, right? Or if you want to look at it another way, the Atlantic sphere and the Indian Ocean sphere, right? So when we're discussing these global marketplaces, you have to understand that they're going to be two very different areas because they're going to provide two different sets of products, and they're also going to provide two different types of colonies and colonial interests, all right? So the thing about it, though, when we talk about those differences, right, you've got growing economic colonies in the Atlantic sphere of the world that are going for access to raw materials and going for access to different kind of colonial goods from this new world sphere of North and South America. But then you have this sphere over here, which is actually still trying to integrate itself into the Indian spice market, but then also in luxury goods coming from Southeast Asia. Now, the very, very first sphere that we're going to focus in on, though, is going to be that Indian Ocean one, right? But just a quick review going all the way back to the 1400s, particularly to the year 1497. Do any of you remember what European country got there first, right? What European country was the very first one to leave the continent of Europe, go all the way around Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope, get all the way into India, and bring a boatload of spices all the way back? Well, that is a very good job, Dardar. I heard you over there. That is exactly right. It's the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese, as Dardar just said, is going to be the very, very first country to get all the way there under the sailorship of a man by the name of Vasco da Gama, right? Following the funding of that entire following the funding of the Portuguese crown under Henry the Navigator, sending all of those boats in that direction, trying to find access routes to those spice markets and luxury items in Southeast Asia, right? Now, the Portuguese did get there first, and they took advantage of that fractured India, right? I think we talked about that in the exploration period as well, about how there were different Indian princes that ruled over all the different territories with India, known as Rajas, and they were going to try and initiate a major spice trade there, right? Now, going into the next thing that you have to understand, or expanding further off that Indian spice trade, off that Indian Ocean sphere of the world, you got to understand that really quickly, that there is some terminology I want you to use, all right? Or something that I want you to know, because on the AP test, you're going to see these words thrown around a little bit, and you're especially going to see them in sources, all right? So we got India, right, which is specifically going to be locating in this light orange right there, right? When you're discussing India, that is one thing. But when you read an excerpt, and if it says the Indies, that's a little bit of a different thing, all right? The Indies is referring to island chains, right? This being the West Indies in the Caribbean, and the East Indies is going to focus more in on your countries of Southeast Asia like Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Thailand, and as well as Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia down here over on the right-hand side, okay? So just know that in the back of your mind. If you ever see Indies, it's referring to a chain of islands. If it's the west ones, it's the Caribbean. If it's the east ones, it's over there in Southeast Asia as well. Now, the thing about it, though, is that what is going to happen is after the ventureship of these different European bodies into these new areas, they're going to start making mad amounts of money, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is that we're going to see the Portuguese who tried to fund this through their government, through their crown, through the royal family, and through the state government. It's going to kind of peter out a little bit, right? And the Portuguese are going to lose a lot of territory in India to those all-important people known as the Dutch, when they established that thing known as the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, also known as the Dutch East India Company, right? Which is going to fund the revamping of the Netherlands. It's going to fund their liberation movement from the Spanish, and it's also going to build a very, very beautiful city known as Amsterdam, and then also Utrecht as well, and several other cities in the Netherlands that base their beautiful, beautiful, beautiful civil infrastructure off canal systems and glory, and just, it's so pretty there. I love the Netherlands more than life itself. But the thing that you have to understand, though, is what type of company that was. This is, again, a big review. It was a joint stock company, right? So joint stock companies are going to begin to pop up due to these global markets, and especially due to the influx of luxury items coming out of India and out of Southeast Asia, right? Now, remember what a joint stock company is, right? It's not a single investor. It's a group of investors that come together to pitch either their boat, their vessel, or their funds into this company, and whatever amount that they chip in, that's the percentage of the profit that they get back in return, right? Hence, a joint stock company, or buying shares in a company, inadvertently leading to the rise of the stock market, right? That thing that some of your parents yell about from time to time. Now, just to also wrap your noggin a little bit, just a little tiny bit around the importance of the establishment of these East India companies, right? You have to understand when you're looking at history's largest companies of all time, right? When we look at their market cap in the trillions of US dollars, right? There's some really big companies out there that you've heard of and you've grown up with your entire life, including Apple, right? Which, as you can see, is actually not that big of a company compared to history's largest companies. And Microsoft also is just a little bit larger. You have Standard Oil, which is going to be owned by J.D. Rockefeller and things like that. That's going to be popping up during the late 1800s, early 1900s in America. But you might have actually heard of the Rockefeller family before, or hence Rockefeller Center in New York City, right? So you might have heard of some of these places, okay? But the thing that you need to understand about the Dutch East India Company, it is the biggest company that history has ever seen. Look how much it dwarfs Apple computers, right? So when you're thinking about the largeness, the intensity, the the liquidity of companies in history, the Dutch East India Company was that large, right? And it was a joint stock company that was bringing all those goods back into the ports of the Netherlands and gaining access to Europeans to all these different goods like silks, spices, teas, porcelains, and even coffee coming from their province of Java in Indonesia, right? But what's going to end up happening, though, is what we're going to see is there's going to be a heavy difference between the way that the Portuguese dealt with the Indians and as well as the Southeast Asians and the way that the Dutch did, right? The Dutch actually used some pretty violent tactics. It is important to know that cities like this were built on violent actions of Dutch colonizers, right? For example, in the city or in the island of Java, where you actually are going to see some of the largest coffee plantations be created by the Dutch, they are actually going to just mass burn and destroy villages and commit terrible atrocities that actually the Dutch have come out and apologized for, since they, like the modern Dutch government has been like, our role in history was not a good one, right? And it was actually really, really negative and violent. Whereas the Portuguese actually early on entered into defense contracts with all these Indian Rajas, being like, hey, if other Europeans show up, we'll protect you from them and stuff like that, which is actually a really interesting kind of dynamic. However, what we're going to realize is that the Dutch way of doing things was much more aggressive, but also much faster, right? And it also took over the Portuguese trade shares and pushed them out. So you're going to see a lot of other Europeans start popping up and copying the Dutch approach and leading to a more imperialistic, violent approach to taking over these places and leading to atrocities that still need to be circumvented, and actually apologized for as history progresses. Because the copycat companies that are going to begin to pop up after the Dutch create their company is the British East India Company, which establishes itself around 1600, and the French East India Company, which establishes itself around 1664 underneath the rulership of Louis XIV and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his mercantilistic finance advisor, right? East India Company of Britain, you know that logo pretty well. The French one is that little guy right there. A little bit more like complicated, a little bit more intense, a little more ridiculous, but it also didn't last nearly as long, all right? Britain and France, though, due to this, are going to start competing with each other because they witnessed the growth in economics, in power, in influence of the Dutch, and they're going to want to slice that pie as well, just like any mercantilist ruler or mercantilist economy would want during this time, because remember, they believe that money is a finite thing, right? And they want as many cookies in that jar as they can get. But France and Britain, having the two of the largest military powers in the entire world, are going to decide to start fighting over this stuff pretty dang quick. So just keep that in the back of your mind that we got a big rivalry between Britain and France a-brewing in these waters, right? Now you got the other sphere of these global markets being the Atlantic trade markets, right? Referring to the Atlantic trade rivalries, particularly over colonial holdings in North and South America, right? So when we shift our perspective from the Indian Ocean era over to the Atlantic, into these two new continents that, of course, the Europeans are starting to get their grubby little mitts on, right? And starting to establish colonies with, you're going to see a growth of colonies way, way beyond any type of colonial growth that's going on in East Asia, right? East Asia was much more of a military action, whereas colonial actions were being taken place in North and South America, where people were literally sending Europeans there to start colonies and have them expand, much like New Orleans, much like Jamestown, much like Plymouth, right? And this is all happening in the aftermath of the Columbian Exchange and the discovery of a lot of these new products like potatoes, new sources of lumber, right? And other different areas to grow things as well, including cotton, rice, and indigo, which is going to be a big thing about dyeing textiles. It's especially going to be important later on when we get to the Industrial Revolution. Now, the results of these colonial growth are the things that we've kind of already talked about a little bit, right? Talked about how the English colonies grew really, really fast because there were whole families of people that moved there. The Spanish colonies grew really, really fast because it was environmentally easy for them to do that because it was usually warm there. And whereas the French colony of New Orleans grew very, very slowly because it was in the swamp and it was gross and like there was malaria everywhere and they had to send prostitutes and prisoners there to populate the whole thing. So going into it though, you have to understand that the results in the growth of this is going to result in some aggressive military rivalries between these parties, right? One of the best instances of this is going to be in 1588 when Elizabeth I and Philip II of Spain are going to start feuding with one another, not only over the rulership of England, because Philip, remember, used to be the king of England when he was married to none other than Bloody Mary, but she died and he lost it, right? But what's also going to happen, though, is something that we didn't talk about that much, though, okay, is that Elizabeth is going to intentionally try to ruin some of his trade that's going on in South and Central America, right? And she started this thing called state-funded piracy, right? Where she would actually hire well-known pirates like Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake to actually raid Spanish galleons, take them over, and steal all of their cargo, right? So you're talking about countries giving money to pirates for them to do pirate-like things, right? And Roddy the Relentless is going to go off over there and do it as well, all right? So now, and as a massive effort to retain access to certain goods, examples of this include English tobacco, then also the Spanish and Portuguese slave trade is going to extremely grow during this time period as well, due to the growth of these colonies also, and also due to the death rates of Native Americans under the encomienda system, right? And then you're also going to see as well the Navigation Acts are going to foreshadow future violence to come. Now, the Navigation Acts were issued by Oliver Cromwell during the Commonwealth period, during like the entire English Civil War period, right, leading up to the Glorious Revolution in 1688. What you're going to see, though, is the Navigation Acts was a set of laws passed by Oliver Cromwell saying that English people had to buy goods that were shipped only on British vessels, right? And that was a little bit of a difficult thing to do because you're trying to cut the Dutch out of their market and stuff like that. And it's also another mercantilistic thing. And what they're trying to do is bleed each other's funds dry to emerge as the economic power. Again, future violence is going to be coming up because of all of these economic rivalries. Now, speaking of, though, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a spoiler here, all right? Certain colonies are going to grow, or excuse me, not certain colonies. One country is going to grow to dominate world trade, though, and it is none other than the British, right? The British are going to basically make a lot of risky moves that pay off for them in a really big way, and their ascendancy is going to be like none other you've ever seen, all right? The colonies that Britain grew, including places like Jamestown, Plymouth, and the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, are going to grow massively wealthy, massively profitable, and also massively large in population very, very quickly, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is their colonial growth is essential to their growth as a military powerhouse because a lot of it goes right back to that East India Company, right? Which is making them huge amounts of money and is bringing all this tobacco in, is bringing all this rice back from places like South Carolina, and is bringing all these different goods like lumber back from North America, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is since it makes so much money, the English government is going to take those profits and begin to tax them, right? And since they can tax them and make a lot of money for the English government, the government will begin to divert some of that tax fund into growing the Navy and building some of these newfangled boats that they have are called ships of the line, right? A ship of the line, or like ship of the line, right, is a massive military vessel that is lined on its entire side with cannons, right? And it's built specifically to fight sea battles, to rid themselves of pirates should they try to show up and raid East India Company cargo liners. But also, here's the key factor, y'all. The growth of the British military is going to protect those East India boats, right? And more East India boats are going to be able to come back, and they're going to begin to make more profits, and the taxes increase this, and so it's a big cycle that just goes round and round and round, where the East India Company is basically financing the growth of the British Navy, right? And something that you need to do really, really quickly is put a star underneath all that stuff and just write, there was no dominant military like the British Navy, right? The British Navy was unmatched in the waters in both its size, its effectiveness, its leadership, and also its armada, all right? So like now, it literally could be just about anybody, and we'll talk about a really, really famous person that was actually the leader of the British Navy when we get to Napoleon, when we talk about Admiral Horatio Nelson, right? This guy was crazy. Now look, but the thing that we have to understand here, though, as well, is looking at basic math of history, right? If you've got a very, very large navy and a lot of money being made, it's going to lead to a very, very angry set of monarchs, right? Who also want the same goods out of this, right? When you got people like Louis XIV seeing the growth of the British Navy and the British colonies, he's going to get really upset. So when you start combining angry monarchs and lots of money, you're going to see the blow up of war, right? All funded and state-sponsored by that mercantilistic idea of there's only so much money in the world, right? So you're going to see some big military actions play out, and these are the risky moves that the British made that just ended up paying off for them in a big way. The British took some dangerous bets on some wars, but they made the right ones, and it's going to end up leading to them being the most dominant trade power in all of Europe, and also the most money-making trade power in all of Europe as well. Now, competition for these goods in both the Asian markets and the Atlantic markets, so you have to understand this is a global marketplace now at this point, when we're looking at Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and the amount of goods moving around through the entire area and going all the way back to Europe. You now have a globalized marketplace, and Britain wants its hands in every single one of those cookie jars, right? And so what's going to happen, though, is a massive set of rivalries. Now, the biggest rivalry that's out there is the one between the British and the French, right? So the British and the French are going to dislike each other the most, and this is especially going to start under the leadership of Louis XIV. But some of you are like, but what about the Dutch, Mr. Terry? Like, so that's a really, really great question about the Dutch, right? But something that we have to understand about the Dutch is there's a little bit of a key difference, right? Is that the Dutch really didn't divert a lot of state funds into their military nearly as much as they actually diverted it back to their shareholders, right? And so the East India Company that was actually being created in the Netherlands was meant much more to be about economic growth of the shareholders and the idea of a joint stock company, not as much to grow their military. And also their military, when it did begin to grow, and they did get into a set of wars known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars with the British to try and actually conserve some of their colonies and to also colonize other areas as well. Because I don't know if any of y'all know this or not, but New York used to actually be called New Amsterdam.
Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. So
exactly, right? So the thing about it, though, is that the Dutch are going to come out on the wrong side of some of those Anglo-Dutch wars. They're going to end up losing a handful of them. The French actually ally with them a couple of different times. But then also you're going to see as well that peace is going to come between the Netherlands and the British, because the Netherlands is going to integrate some of their people into the British crown. Remember, William of Orange was actually one of the state leaders of the Netherlands, and he is going to come over during the, there we go. So now he's going to come over during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 with Mary Stuart and actually rise to prominence. And so you're going to see the integration of the Netherlandish blood with the British crown, leading to more peaceful negotiations between them, right? And actually a long-standing alliance, all right? So the thing about it, though, is that if you got this whole problem, if the French were allying with the Dutch, but the Dutch are now with the English, then who's the only two left? You got the British and the French that are going to end up going after each other, right? Now, there are 3 key wars that play out that actually really, really dictate the growth of the British and dictate the growth of the British Empire and their military dominance, right? Number 1, okay, when we get into these big fights, all right? By the way, also giving you a heads up, we're calling them British now, not English anymore, because by the way, since 1707, it's now called Great Britain, because the Acts of the Union is going to actually permanently bond Scotland and like England together and be referred to now as Great Britain, right? Now, the most powerful kingdom, though, of course, between the war is still going to be the English, right? Now, so going into it, though, you have to understand that round 1 of these big wars was that one war that we've already talked about, right? It was the War of Spanish Succession, the one where Louis XIV tried to expand into Spain, right? Remember that whole thing? There were colonial causes to this as well, because when his grandson, Philip, was going to rise up as the new king of Spain, Louis XIV was like, wait a minute, if I combine the colonies of France and the colonies of Spain together, we could push the British out completely and end up taking the dominant swath and the most cookies in our jar, right? So what's going to end up happening, though, is the results of this war is actually not going to go the way that Louis, really wanted it to. It basically was a draw, right? The Peace of Utrecht is going to lead to a loss of French territory, particularly focused in areas like Canada and stuff like that, and you're also going to see a loss of their territory on some of their eastern borders, all right? Now, the thing about it, though, is also this war is going to leave particularly the Dutch and Spanish and French kind of weak militarily, because Louis fought too many wars leading up to this, like the 9 Years' War as well before that, and then also their involvement in the 30 Years' War going back to 1648. Now, the Dutch, Spain, and French are going to be left weak, and there's going to be a permanent split between France and Spain, so they'll be created autonomous countries, and this all relates back to that whole concept of the balance of power, where all of Europe came together just to tell Louis to calm down, right? So going into it, though, what's going to happen pretty soon after the War of Spanish Succession, right around 1715, is Louis XIV is going to die, and his grandson is going to take over. Now, his grandson was 5 when he took over, right? But he will become Louis XV, right? He's that same kid that Peter the Great was like holding in a picture that I showed y'all at one point. And so the young king will take over, and then later in his years as an adult, though, you're going to see another war break out that we've also already talked about a little bit, and it was called the War of Austrian Succession, when Frederick the Great fought against Austria because they had a woman rise to power, and that's going to be Maria Theresa. Frederick the Great is going to seize this area known as Silesia, right? And he's going to go after it because Maria Theresa rose to the crown of Austria, her children being Joseph II, Leopold II, and of course, famously, another lady that we'll talk about here in a second. But also, it's going to basically be a tie, except for Prussia, because they're going to get a lot of new land, right? And, they are going to get Silesia, and they're going to own it and contain it, but Austria and Prussia went to these 2 rivals to side with them to make their war a little bit more effective. So the Prussians actually played France and Britain against each other. Prussia went up to France and said, hey, will you ally with us to go against the Austrians? And Austria, under Maria Theresa, went to the English and said, hey, will you ally with us against the Prussians and the French? And they both agreed to do so because they can't stand each other, but also because France and Britain were looking for a reason to fight. Because when we look at this one colony in India known as Madras, which is actually a southern Indian colony that actually the British made a lot of money off of, the French wanted it really bad. So they were just hoping to get into a war with Britain so they could also escalate the war in some of the colonial areas, and the French are actually going to beat up the British and actually end up taking Madras back from them for a hot second, right? So what's going to end up happening, though, okay, is that during this whole war process, the British are going to look at Maria Theresa and be like, hey, do you really need Silesia that bad? Maybe you should just let it go. And she's going to be super offended by this and be like, what the heck? And he's going to break the alliance with the British, and the Prussians are going to break their alliance with the French as well because they feel like they're just being puppeted for Indian gain, right? What's going to end up happening, though, after that is a third big war, right? The biggest one out of all of them, right? Because no war brought Britain more power than the very first World War, known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, all right? Which, when we talked about this, okay, we talked about it a little bit in class, the 7 Years' War is the European theater of that war. The French and Indian War is the North American theater of that war, right? Because this rivalry did not go anywhere, right? And this is round 3 of a very, very big boxing match between the British and the French, right? Because the British are still very upset that they lost that colony of Madras to the French for a hot second, but also on top of that, there's a lot of disputed territory going on in North America. Because if you look at a colonial map of North America, you can actually see that the French control a lot of stuff west of the Mississippi, and the British control everything east of the Mississippi. Well, there you see all this line stuff right here? No one could agree because there wasn't really any territorial marking of where the British land started and stopped and where the French land started and stopped. So there was a lot of skirmishes that broke out amongst that disputed territory. But also what we're going to see as well, though, is the Prussians and the Austrians are going to go for each other's throats yet again during this entire instigation, but they're going to have an alliance switch, okay? What's going to happen is the French are going to ally with the Austrians, a longtime rival of theirs, and the British actually ally with the Prussians, right? So what we can see this actually in the image of Marie Antoinette, because that's what she was, y'all. She was an Austrian princess that got married off to the French because of this new treaty, right? She was the binding agreement that sealed the deal between the Austrians and the French that their alliance would hold through during the 7 Years' War period of this big war, right? During the European War, or theater of it as well. Now, the cause in Europe was Prussia invaded Saxony, which is an Austrian ally, right? Of course, because Austria controlled the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and that's going to make the Austrians mad, so they're going to go to war with each other with these new alliances, right? And the cause in North America was that disputed territory, right? But why is it called the French and Indian War? Reason why it's called that is because the French had to ally with the Native Americans to go against the British, because the French colonies in North America didn't have a big population, right? They had a lot of land, but not a lot of people over there, because journeymen and the way the French did the economics on a global scale was very different from the way the British did, whereas the British had tons of people in their colonies because the whole families moved there and relocated, and also due to the growth of their market-based capital economies that were going on there, right? So you had larger population for the British, so it was like the British versus the Native Americans and the French, right? Now, the cause everywhere else, though, is just economic rivalries, right? Because notice what I said, it's the very first World War, right? Now, some of y'all are like, but I thought the World War I was in the 1900s. You're right, but this is the very first global war, right? Because fighting broke out in India, Africa, South America, in the Philippines as well, and you're going to see fighting actually break out all over this new global economic thing, right? Remember I told you that the global economics, these big spheres of it, the global economics now go worldwide, and that was the biggest thing that actually instilled this big rivalry, and Britain and France are going to go at each other's throats. But what's going to end up happening is little French sad frog over here, is the French actually do end up losing this entire giant campaign against the British, right? And what's going to end up going down, though, is the reason why they lose is because, or the treaty, oh my God, would you stop doing that? The Treaty of Paris gets signed, right? Due to the fact that the naval power of Britain was still just unmatched, right? That thing from earlier I said in the flip is coming back in right now, right? The British Navy is just unmatched, right? And the Treaty of Paris is going to actually end up being signed as a peace document between the French and British, where the French lost a lot of stuff and were extremely embarrassed, right? France is going to lose, the Louisiana territory, and they're going to give it to Spain just so it doesn't end up in the hands of the British, right? They're also going to lose Canada, and they're going to lose a lot of land east of the Mississippi that was in that disputed territory area. France is going to get kicked out of India completely, and their French East India Company will dissolve, right? France only is going to be allowed to keep one colony in North America, known as Saint-Domingue, which is actually going to later be called Haiti, which is going to prove a big problem for them as well. Prussia is going to continue to grow because their territorial gains increased after the Treaty of Paris, because remember, they went with the British side, right? Britain is also going to have manageable debt, right? Okay, like now they're going to be in debt, but because they have a growing empire, the Atlantic Indian Ocean trade and stuff like that, they're going to be in a lot more debt, but France is now going to be in crippling debt. I need you to focus in on that. France's debt is crippling them, right? And Britain is going to make tragic steps, though, that's going to lead to the American Revolution, but Britain is now the dominant power in the world from winning the 7 Years' War and the, the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War, right? But we'll talk more about that in class. We'll review all this stuff then. I hope y'all have a great rest of your break. I'll see y'all on Tuesday. Y'all have a good one.